Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Judge. I am a retired history professor and author. I'm a Viking resident historian, and I'm just an old guy who loves to do history. Perhaps I've seen some of you on previous Viking cruises, and if not, hopefully I'll see some of you when we get to cruising again. Of course, you are welcome to enter questions during the course of my talk. And I think maybe we can get started with the slides, James. My talk today is on the history of Germany, or as I prefer to say, German history, because up till 150 years ago, there was no country called Germany, but of course there were German people who spoke German and lived in Central Europe. And so we'll focus on their history and on their culture, okay? Next slide. Today, the Federal Republic of Germany, or the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, is the country with the largest population and the largest economy in the European Union. Germany has about 83 million people and a gross domestic product per capita that's now, I think, up to about 53,000 US dollars, which puts it a little lower than the United States, but higher than the United Kingdom or France. But of course, Germany has not always been so stable and prosperous. Oh, next slide. So this is our overview. We'll start out with the coming of age of Germany, earliest times of medieval Germany. Then we'll talk about a number of important German cultural icons, figures who made an impact on German cultural history. Then we'll go to the 19th century, to the 1800s, to the German quest for unity and empire. And we'll finish up with the turbulent and violent 20th century and beyond. Okay? The German people, like many Europeans, are descendants of the so-called Germanic barbarians that overran the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. But after a few centuries, much of the West was reunited. The Germans had divided it up into smaller Germanic kingdoms, but by around 800, much of the West was reunited under the leadership of the Emperor Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, Karl der Grosse, who carved out an empire that included much of what is today France and Germany and northern Italy. And in the year 800, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope. But of course, he wasn't a Roman. He was a German, and his empire wasn't Roman. It was German, and it didn't stay united for very long. After he died, a generation after he died in 843, his grandsons divided up the empire. The western part eventually became what we call the Kingdom of France. And the eastern part in Central Europe and northern Italy came to be known as the Holy Roman Empire. But it was mainly just an assortment of semi-independent cities and towns and principalities and duchies that pretty much ran their own affair. Okay, next. Faced with this situation, a group of cities, ports in northern Germany, by the 1300s, formed an association that was called the Hanseatic League. It was led by Lübeck and Hamburg, and at its height, it stretched all the way from London in the west to Bergen in Norway in the north to Novgorod in Russia in the east, and it included over 100 different cities and towns. It was mainly a trading alliance, a commercial alliance, sort of maybe like an early forerunner of the European Union. And it dominated Baltic trade from about the 1300s to the 1600s for about 3 centuries. Okay? Now, by the 14th century, although the Holy Roman Empire looks impressive on this map, that big orange area in the middle of Europe, the emperor and the central government didn't really exercise much power. There really wasn't much of a central government. The emperor was sort of like an overlord, and the various independent cities and towns and duchies and principalities paid lip service to the emperor as their overlord. But they pretty much, as I said earlier, they pretty much ran their own affairs. A few centuries later, the great French philosopher, the philosophe Voltaire, pointed out that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Other than that, I guess the name worked pretty well. Okay, next slide. So rather than focusing on all these various assorted cities and principalities and duchies that made up the Holy Roman Emperor, I will focus instead on some important cultural icons, some key figures in the history of German culture. Okay? Let's start with Albrecht Dürer, the great German Renaissance artist. Dürer was born and raised in Nuremberg, but as a young man, he traveled to Italy. I should say he walked to Italy, which is quite an accomplishment. He went to Italy on foot. He met with Giovanni Bellini. He had contacts with Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci and other Italian Renaissance artists. And he returned to Nuremberg to become perhaps the greatest German Renaissance artist. Dürer was a portrait painter, as you can see in the self-portrait of him on the left on this slide, as well as in the portrait that he painted of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in the upper center. But he was also a landscape painter. He painted altarpieces. He painted animals like that hare down the bottom. He painted the iconic praying hands, which was originally scheduled to be part of a larger work. And beyond that, he was something of an inventor and an innovator. This was a time when printing was coming more and more into fashion, more and more into vogue. And Dürer did a lot of wood carvings and etchings and engravings that could be inked and then be used to print multiple copies. So he was able to print a number of different artworks. Okay, next. In religion, the most prominent of all German religious figures is, of course, Martin Luther. A young man who started out as a Catholic priest, as an Augustinian monk, but he was interested in trying to reform the Catholic Church and do away with corrupt practices like the sale of indulgences that made it seem like you could save your soul by donating money to the church. And when he tried to do that, he ran into opposition from the Pope and the Vatican and the church leadership and the Holy Roman Emperor. So he eventually broke away and formed his own religion, the Lutheran denomination, which was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which divided Europe up into different religious Christian dominations. Catholics in the south, in green on this map, you can see in Spain and France and Italy, as well as in Ireland and over in Poland. Lutheran Protestants in the north, in Scandinavia and northern Germany, and a number of other Protestant denominations, such as Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Calvinists in blue and purple on this map. Now, one of Luther's big goals was to try to make it possible for people to worship and to read the Bible in their own language. So one of the main things he did was he translated the Bible from Latin into German so that the German people, so his people, could read the Bible and so that they could go to worship services, which, unlike Latin Catholic masses, were in the German language. And in this, he was aided and abetted by another great German cultural icon, Johannes Gutenberg, who in the 1400s, in the 15th century, had invented the movable type printing press, which made it possible to print multiple copies of the Lutheran Bible, as well as other works by Luther, other Protestant writers, and eventually also by Catholics. Okay. In terms of music, the great German Baroque composer was Johann Sebastian Bach, who lived in the late 1600s and early 1700s. He was a master of various musical forms. His Brandenburg concertos, for example, were 6 instrumental works using a wide range of orchestral instruments. His Goldberg variations were compositions for the harpsichord with 30 different variations. His St. Matthew Passion was a composition of orchestra and vocal and solo, which was based on the Gospel of Matthew, the Passion in the Lutheran Bible. And perhaps ironically, since Bach was a relatively devout Lutheran, his most celebrated work is a version, a choral and orchestral rendition of the Roman Catholic Latin Mass, the Mass in B minor, which is now considered one of the greatest musical compositions in all of history. Okay. Not to be outdone, of course, is the great prolific German musical genius Ludwig van Beethoven, who lived from 1770 to 1827 and who made the transition from the Baroque and classical era to the Romantic era. Beethoven was remarkably prolific. He composed a total of 9 major symphonies, also numerous sonatas and concertos, cantatas, 5 piano concertos, a violin concerto, 32 sonatas, 18-string quartets, a mass, an opera. His 3rd symphony, the Eroica, was written for Napoleon, and it glorifies heroism. His 6th symphony celebrates nature, and his splendid, magnificent ninth symphony climaxes with a magnificent, splendid, stunning choral rendition of a magnificent romantic poem by Friedrich Schiller called the Ode to Joy, one of the most beloved and well-known musical works of all times. Okay. Next. In terms of literature, the great German literary figure, the German Shakespeare, if you will, was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who, as a novelist, was famous perhaps most for the Trials of Young Werther, a novel about unreturned, unrequited love. As a playwright, his fame stems largely from Faust, a 2-part play, Faust 1 and 2. As most of you know, it's about a man who sells his soul to the devil. And if you've been following the newspapers in the UK and US lately, pundits and politicians are accusing each other of making Faustian bargains, which means attempts to advance their careers by selling their souls. More than that, however, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was also a poet. He wrote 283 poems, including The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and he was an essayist. He wrote essays on anatomy, botany, color, light, and prisms. So he was, all in all, a man for all seasons and a universal genius. Okay. So was Alexander von Humboldt, the great German scientist and explorer. Now, from 1799 to 1804, von Humboldt made a journey to the Americas, an exploration of the Americas. He met in North America with President Thomas Jefferson and with a number of American scientists. He traveled throughout Central and South America. He was the first to study and document the Andean jungles, the rainforests of the Andes. He discovered the Humboldt Current in the Pacific Ocean, which is sort of like the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean, except it brings cold water up from the south. He was the first to propose that in prehistoric times, Africa and the Americas may have all been part of one large continent. They seem to fit together. And very relevant for today, he was the first to propose that climate change could be caused by human behavior. His masterwork is called simply Cosmos, Physical Description of the Universe. Next. In terms of romantic art, romantic painting, the most famous name is probably Caspar David Friedrich, who was a landscape painter who loved to paint natural scenes, usually with one or two figures confronting a sunset or a sunrise or a storm, a moonrise, a moonset, or fog, like this picture here, a wanderer confronting a sea of fog, a wanderer above the sea of fog. He's probably the most well-known German landscape romantic painter of the early 1800s. Next. In terms of opera, probably the most famous German name is the composer Richard Wagner. And his most famous opera is the four-cycle Ring of the Nibelung, or the Ring Cycle four-part opera, which was based on Nordic Viking mythology. You can see the painting, the image there of Brunhilde, the Valkyrie, as well as Wagner himself on the right. Wagner was also rather controversial because of some anti-Semitic writings. He wrote at one point that the Jews would never be able to compose great music because they lacked the German soul. They lacked the Volksgeist. And in the 20th century, after he was gone, he also became sort of infamous or notorious as Hitler's famous musician. Next. Equally notorious was the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that God is dead, by which he apparently meant that in modern scientific society, people would look to science rather than religion to get answers to their questions or to solve their problems. So, for example, if there's a pandemic, people would look to masks and vaccines to try to solve the problem rather than prayer. Although I suspect that a lot of people have also prayed during the recent pandemics. Nietzsche's most famous philosophical concept was that of the Übermensch, or the ideal superior man of the future who would rise above Christian morality and who would impose his own values on human society. This idea obviously also would appeal to Hitler in the 20th century. But Nietzsche was an important philosopher who made important contributions to the study of ethics and truth and reality. I probably shouldn't say this, but I had a college professor who used to like to say that, I went to a Jesuit college, by the way, and this professor used to like to say that he didn't believe that God was dead, but he was pretty sure that Nietzsche was dead. Probably a cheap shot. Okay, next. Okay, from here we move on to the 19th century, to the 1800s, and the German quest for unity and empire. Next slide. The old Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for about 1,000 years, was finally abolished by Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor, in 1806 when he conquered most of continental Europe. And then in 1815, when Napoleon was overthrown, the Holy Roman Empire was replaced by something called the German Confederation, which was sort of a loose-knit organization of 39 different German states, the largest and most powerful of which was Prussia. In the year 1848, two Germans who wound up living in England by the name of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote an important, dynamic, revolutionary pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. That same year, 1848, there were revolutions that took place all across the European continent in most of the major cities of Europe. Revolutions in favor of nationalism, in favor of democracy, in favor of more freedom, against oppressive autocracy. And one of those revolutions took place in the city of Berlin, which was the capital of Prussia, which, as I said, was the largest and most powerful of all the 39 states in the German Confederation. This painting shows the rioting and demonstrations in Berlin in 1848. The demonstrations and revolutions so unnerved the Prussian king that he agreed to grant his people an elected parliament. They could elect their own representatives who would represent them and help him make laws which share power with him. He effectively promised them a constitution. And so things quieted down, and for about a decade or so, Prussia was what we might call a constitutional monarchy. But the next king in the early 1860s discovered, as kings often do, that the parliament wouldn't do what he told it to do. He couldn't figure this out. He was king. I'm telling you to do this. And they wouldn't do it. They voted him down. They voted against him. And at one point, he threatened to abdicate his throne. And then instead, he appointed as his first minister, as his minister president of Prussia, a giant of a man by the name of Otto von Bismarck. Next slide. Now, Bismarck took over in 1862 with the idea of unifying Germany under Prussian rule. Bismarck had no use for parliaments, he had no use for democracy, he had no use for speeches, and he's famous for saying that the great issues of the day would be decided not by speeches and parliamentary majorities, but by blood and iron. And he set out to unify Germany, effectively have Prussia take over the rest of the German Confederation. And by 1867, using the powerful Prussian army, using war and the threat of war and diplomacy, he had managed to unify most of northern Germany in what was called the North German Confederation. But southern Germany, states like Bavaria and Baden and Württemberg, remained outside of the Confederation, largely because they were Catholic. Northern Germany, as we saw, was mostly Protestant, mostly Lutheran. The Catholics in southern Germany were concerned that if they joined the Confederation, they would be oppressed and repressed by the Protestants in the north. So Bismarck came up with a very clever but very devious strategy. He provoked the French, he provoked France into declaring war on Germany, declaring war on Prussia and the other Germans, figuring that the southern German states would have no choice but to join the rest of Germany in fighting against their mortal enemy, France. Next slide. And it worked like a charm. The so-called Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 lasted only 4 months, from September of 1870 to January of 1871. It was a smashing German victory. The Germans, north and south, united. They invaded France. They took control of most of northern France, including the city of Paris. And in January of 1871, January 18th of 1871, 150 years ago yesterday, at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris, the Prussian king, William I, was crowned German emperor, or Kaiser Wilhelm I. Germany was now united. Germany was an empire. France was humiliated. France was furious. In part because the Germans not only defeated France, but took over the wealthy coal-producing areas of Alsace and Lorraine in northeastern France. And the French began looking for a way to get revenge against the Germans. Next slide. But revenge would not be easy. because Germany soon emerged as the single most powerful country in all of continental Europe. It already had the strongest army, the Great Prussian Army, and when that was merged with the manufacturing and industrial strength of Western Germany, Germany became an military industrial powerhouse. By the early 20th century, it had surpassed Great Britain, surpassed the United Kingdom as Europe's largest and strongest industrial economy, with industries like the BASF Chemical Works, which is pictured here in this image, this painting, as well as the Krupp Steel Works and weapons factories. Germany also had thousands of miles of railways that were built by Bismarck to bring raw materials to the factories and then to ship finished goods to market. And Bismarck helped make Germany into Europe's strongest power, into a world leader in areas like the production of iron and coal and steel and chemicals, and perhaps most ominously, weapons. Next slide. In the year 1888, Germany got a new ruler. The new emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was a brash and belligerent young man who decided that Germany should not only have a European empire, it should have a global empire. The French and the British already had global empires. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Belgians already had overseas colonies, and Germany needed to have its place in the sun, according to the Kaiser. So the Germans created or established overseas colonies in Africa, in Togo, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, German East Africa, as well as in Samoa and New Guinea, and even in China. The area around the city of Qingdao or Tsingtao became a German concession, sort of a small German colony. And if you've ever traveled in China and you like to drink beer, you probably have tasted that Tsingtao beer that is served throughout China. It is brewed in a brewery that the Germans established in 1903 when they were rulers of that part of China. But there was something else, perhaps even more ominous, even more important, that Kaiser Wilhelm II did. In 1890, he fired Germany. He fired Bismarck. He didn't fire Germany. He fired Bismarck. He pushed the old man into retirement. By this time, Bismarck was an old man, and the young and brash and belligerent Wilhelm wanted to run his own affairs. In that same year, 1890, he refused to renew a treaty with Russia that Bismarck had negotiated. This was one of the biggest mistakes ever made in German history because the Russians were upset, the Russians were frustrated, the Russians were angry, and the Russians were afraid of German power. So within a few years, the Russians made an alliance with France, which left Germany in a very precarious position because now it had enemies on both sides, on both its east and its west. Now, Germany was very powerful. Everybody knew that Germany was powerful enough to defeat France. Everybody knew that Germany was powerful enough to defeat Russia. But what nobody knew was Germany really powerful enough to defeat France and Russia at the same time in a two-front war? Okay, next slide. The answer would come in the turbulent 20th century when Germany would fight two world wars against France and Russia, as well as other countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States. Okay? Next. The First World War, the Great War, what we now call World War I, broke out in 1914 with Germany and Austria fighting against France and Russia and Britain. Determined to avoid having to fight a two-front war, the Germans came up with a rather clever strategy. They figured Russia was such a large, backward country that it would take the Russians at least 5 or 6 weeks to mobilize their forces and move them to the front lines to be able to invade Germany. So the Germans thought we have a 5 or 6 week window to defeat the French. So they launched a massive invasion of France through the neutral country of Belgium with the idea that they would knock France out of the war before the Russians could invade, and then they could turn east and deal with the Russians. And it almost worked. The German advance got to within several miles of Paris. But the French managed somehow to stop the Germans at the Marne River outside of Paris. And in the meantime, the Russians from the east invaded sooner than expected. And by the end of 1914, the war had bogged down into a brutal, devastating, debilitating, horrific stalemate, with both sides dug in lines of trenches facing each other across a no man's land, maybe 50 or 100 yards wide, which was littered with landmines and pocked with craters of artillery shells, sometimes with dead bodies, with barbed wires. And anytime groups of soldiers would try to attack across the no man's land, machine guns on the other side would mow them down. The machine guns were all aimed at about 18 inches above the ground. So when the soldiers tried to run across the no man's land, the machine guns would shoot their legs out from under them. This is where we get the impression to cut someone off at the knees. The deadlock, the stalemate, dragged on year after year until 1917, when things began to change. 3 important things happened. First of all, in April of 1917, the United States, which was upset about German submarine warfare and German meddling in Mexico, declared war on Imperial Germany. Second thing that happened was the British began deploying a new weapon called the tank, an armored vehicle that was impervious to machine gun fire and that ran on treads instead of wheels, so it could roll over the trenches, roll over the landmines, roll over the barbed wire, an ideal vehicle for breaking through the trench warfare, breaking the stalemate. At the same time, the third thing that happened favored the Germans. There were revolutions in Russia. The first revolution earlier in the year overthrew the Tsar, overthrew the old Imperial Russian government. The second revolution in October or November brought to power the Bolsheviks, the Soviet communists, and in early 1918, they pulled Russia out of the war. Early 1918, Germany found itself in a situation where it no longer had to worry about Russia in the east. So now it had a window of opportunity. It could launch a major offensive against France in the west and maybe win the war. But the window of opportunity was a very short-term window. They had to win the war before the Americans could send over enough troops to turn the tide, and before the British could produce and deploy enough tanks to turn the tide. In March and April and the spring of 1918, they launched this major offensive. It made great gains. It drove the Allies back, but it didn't achieve a breakthrough. And by summer, the offensive had failed. By fall, large numbers of arriving U.S. troops, American GIs, along with the British tanks, and along with also the Spanish flu, which the devastating pandemic, which killed millions of people worldwide and hit Germany especially hard because of the British blockade. The British had been blockading Germany for years, cutting off supplies and food, so the Germans were on the verge of starvation. By October, the German armies were in retreat, and the Germans in November agreed to an armistice that took effect at 11 o'clock in the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the famous 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Next slide. But this was just an armistice. It was a ceasefire, a stacking of arms, a truce. They still had to work out a treaty to officially end the war. So the leaders of the Allied powers met in Paris, mostly outside of Paris at the Great Palace of Versailles. And in June of 1919, they forced they compelled the Germans to sign an onerous, rigorous treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, which took away all of Germany's worldwide territory, all of its overseas colonies. It returned Alsace and Lorraine back to France, as well as giving some German territories to Denmark and to Poland and other European neighbors. It reduced the size of the German army to no more than 100,000 soldiers. So the whole army could have fit in what is now the football stadium at the University of Michigan, where my wife and I went to school. And the German Navy by this time had been scuttled. And perhaps most resented of all, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany for the war, said the Germans started the war was their fault, and therefore they should have to pay reparations. They should have to repair all the damage that was done in France and elsewhere for the war. And so reparations were imposed, reparation payments of over $30 billion, about $33 billion, which would be about $270, $280 billion in today's money, an enormous sum for the time, were imposed upon the Germans. Next slide. Now, these reparation payments hamstrung and hampered the so-called Weimar Republic, which replaced the empire, which replaced the empire of the Kaiser. Kaiser was forced to step down, to abdicate in November of 1918. A new constitution was created at the city of Weimar. The Weimar Republic was a very democratic form of governance, but it was hampered from the very beginning by having to make these enormous reparations payments. It was impossible under these conditions to revive the German economy. By 1923, the Weimar regime, the Weimar Republic, found itself in desperate straits. It did not have the money to pay the reparations duties to the French. It did not have the money to pay compensation to the thousands of wounded war veterans, and it did not have the money to pay unemployment benefits to striking workers in Western Germany. So in order to make these payments, it printed large amounts of paper money, which created hyperinflation. The money quickly became useless. By November, it cost like 1 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. People went to the store with bushel baskets full of paper bills, or better yet, they just used the paper bills to fuel their stoves and furnaces to provide heat and cooking for themselves. It was an enormous crisis, but the Germans survived. The Weimar Republic survived with help from the United States, from plans called the Young Plan, the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. The Americans, through American financial institutions, U.S. banks, agreed to provide all sorts of low-interest loans, millions of dollars of low-interest loans to the Germans to help them stabilize their economy. The Germans could then use this money to pay reparation duties to France and to others, and then the French could then use this money to repay the Americans for money that was borrowed from them during the First World War to help continue the war. So it was kind of a circular thing, but it worked. By 1929, Germany was stable and prosperous. It had made treaty agreements with its neighbors. It seemed to be doing well economically. The Weimar Republic looked sound and stable and democratic. And then the bottom fell out. In October of 1929, the New York stock market crashed, and then came the Great Depression. By 1932, millions of Germans were out of work, and German workers, desperate, began voting for extreme parties of the far left and the far right. And the far left was the communists. The far right were the National Socialists, or the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler. By 1932, The two largest parties in the German parliament, the Reichstag, were the communists and the Nazis, the National Socialists. So in early 1933, German industrialists and capitalists who were scared to death of the communists decided to go with what they saw as a lesser of two evils. And in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler, the Nazi leader, became the Chancellor of Germany. Next slide. And Hitler almost immediately destroyed German democracy. In February, a month after he took power, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, burnt down. Hitler declared a state of emergency. He assumed emergency powers. He blamed the communists. He outlawed the Communist Party, which was the second largest party next to the Nazis, and then proceeded in the next few months to outlaw, to ban all other political parties. So by summer of 1933, Germany was a one-party state. It was no longer a democracy. It was a single-party state that Hitler liked to call the Third Reich, the Third Empire, after the Holy Roman Emperor and the empire created by Bismarck. Hitler staged mass rallies, as the one pictured here at the city of Nuremberg, to rouse the patriotism, the nationalist fervor, the fears and the hopes and the dreams of the German people, whom he called a master race, a superior race. In 1936, the Summer Olympics were held in the German capital of Berlin. Hitler used it, or tried to use it, as an opportunity to showcase the superiority of the German master race. And indeed, the Germans did win the most medals, but a great African-American athlete, Jesse Owens, stole the show by winning 4 gold medals, much to the dismay of Adolf Hitler, because Jesse Owens was African-American. Jesse Owens was African-American. He was not obviously part of the so-called German master race. And Hitler turned against the Jews. The Nazis depicted the Jews as an impure race. They took away Jewish citizenship. They took away Jewish human rights. And in November 9th of 1938, on what came to be called Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, hundreds of Jewish stores and synagogues and businesses were destroyed by arson, by looting, by vandalism, anti-Semitic feeling, and what might in retrospect be seen as the beginning of what came to be called the Holocaust. Okay, next. At the same time, Hitler was also expanding. He was determined to establish German domination over all of Europe and perhaps over all of the world. In 1938 and 1939, having rebuilt the German military forces, he expanded German power into Austria and Czechoslovakia with very little resistance from Britain and France, from the Western powers, who were dealing with their own problems in the Great Depression. But on September 1st of 1939, when Hitler sent his armies into Poland, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, starting what would later come to be called the Second World War. Now, Britain and France were in no position. They had neither the will nor the power to stop the German invasion of Poland. And so by October 1st, as you can see on the slide on the left here, the Germans were marching into the capital, the Polish capital of Warsaw. But the big shock that shocked the world came in spring of 1940. In May and June of 1940, the Germans invaded the Low Countries, Netherlands, and Belgium, and then moved into France. And in 6 weeks, they defeated mighty France. Hitler had accomplished what the German armies had failed to accomplish in World War I. He had conquered France. He defeated France. You can see in the middle photo here, German troops marching down the Champs-Élysées with the Arc de Triomphe in the background. And so for the next year, from June of 1940 until June of 1941, the United Kingdom, Britain, stood alone against the mighty German onslaught. But somehow, under the spirited leadership of Winston Churchill, the British managed to hold on until help came, until Hitler overreached himself. In June of 1941, Hitler moved east and invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in the history of the world. 3 million troops advancing on a 1,000-mile front. And at first, the Germans moved deep into Soviet territory, winning victory after victory, destroying, burning to the ground thousands of towns and cities, killing hundreds of thousands of people. But at the end of 1942, the Soviet Red Army finally stopped the German advances at the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August of 1942 till January of 1943, and is seen in retrospect as the major turning point of the war. By this time, of course, the United States was also involved. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. And so Hitler was now facing the combined might, not just of the British Empire, but also of the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And by 1943, 1944, the tide was beginning to turn against the Germans. Next slide. Meanwhile, in what came to be called the final solution, or what Hitler and Eichmann and Himmler called the final solution to what they called the Jewish problem, the Germans set up camps. They're sometimes all lumped together as concentration camps, but there were two very different kind of camps. The first, pictured in the upper left, were prison camps, labor camps like Dachau. You can see Heinrich Himmler at Dachau there. They were mostly in Germany, and they were places where enemies of the Third Reich were imprisoned. Not just Jews, but also communists and gypsies or Roma, homosexuals, anybody that the Nazis didn't particularly like, anyone that they saw as a threat. Even worse and much more horrifying were the other kind of camps, the death camps, the extermination camps, camps set up for the purpose of committing mass murder. These were mostly in Poland, and they had names like Treblinka and Majdanek and Belzec and Sobibor, and most horrifying of all, Auschwitz, which is pictured on the upper right, a place for the mass murder of human beings where somewhere between 1 and 2 million human beings were murdered during the course of 1942, 43, 44, and early 45. Next slide. When the war finally ended, the outside world, which had already some inkling of what was going on, became aware of the full horror of what had happened, as photos and movies of starving prisoners who had somehow managed to survive, or of bulldozers bulldozing thousands of bodies into mass graves, became clear to the outside world the extent of the horror that had happened. In all, about 13 million people were murdered by the Germans. 6 million Jews in what we call the Holocaust, an act of genocide, wiping out more than half of all the Jews in Europe. 3 million Polish Catholics, 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, as well as an assortment of other people in other countries who were enemies of the Reich. Okay, next. That was the worst atrocity, but was by no means the only atrocity. The other great atrocity, another great atrocity of World War II, was the aerial bombing of cities, using airplanes to drop bombs on civilian populations, on men, women, and children, civilians living in cities, not just military targets. The Germans started it by bombing Polish cities in 1939 as they invaded Poland. Then in 1940, they bombed London in what came to be called the Blitz. The British retaliated by bombing German cities, and the Americans joined in the bombing of places like Hamburg and Jülich and Dresden, incinerating thousands of people with firebombs, incendiating bombs, creating mass destruction and damage. In June of 1944, as I'm sure you all know, the Western Allies, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, some French, staged the D-Day invasion of Normandy, June 6th of 1944. A few weeks later, the Russians mounted a major operation on the Eastern Front, and Germany was slowly squeezed in a vice from east and west until in April of 1945, Hitler committed suicide. In May of 1945, the Germans surrendered, and the German Third Reich, which was, according to Hitler, supposed to last for 1,000 years, lasted only about 12 and a half years. Next slide. But German suffering was far from over. The war was over, but Germany's challenges were not. When the war ended, Germany was divided into occupation zones by the victorious Allies. Western Germany was divided up by the British in green, the French in blue, the Americans in orange occupation zones. East Central Germany became a Soviet occupation zone in red in this map, and the far easternmost parts of Germany in yellow on this map were given to Poland and to Russia. To make matters even more complicated, the city of Berlin, the German capital, which sat right in the middle of the Soviet-occupied zone. Actually, if you look there, you can see on the map it's closer to the eastern part of the Soviet-occupied zone, about 100 miles behind what came to be called the Iron Curtain. The city of Berlin was also divided up into occupation zones, with the Americans, the French, and the British in West Berlin, and the Soviets occupying East Berlin. As the Cold War set in by 1948, the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, decided he had to somehow get the Western Allies out of Berlin. And so he opted for a blockade, cutting off all road and railway access from Western Germany across East Germany to Berlin. But rather than giving up and getting out, the Western Allies, the US and the UK, mounted an 11-month airlift, sending round-the-clock planes, cargo planes, into the 3 airports in West Berlin, bringing food and supplies to help the people of West Berlin maintain their freedom and survive the long, difficult German winter. In May of 1949, Stalin finally lifted his blockade, and Eastern Germany, the Soviet zone, later that year became a communist nation, a communist satellite state called the German Democratic Republic, or simply East Germany, a communist country controlled by the German communists who were under the leadership of the Soviets. Next slide. In 1961, I should say, in order to stop East Germans from escaping to the West, the Soviets and the East Germans built the Berlin Wall, a 27-mile-long wall down the middle of the city of Berlin, separating free West Berlin from communist East Berlin. But West Germany did better. In 1949, the occupation zones of Britain and France and the United States were merged to form the German Federal Republic, which came to be called simply West Germany. In 1955, West Germany, the German Federal Republic, became a member of NATO, the Western Alliance. And so the Germans, by 1955, at least West Germany, was now an ally of former enemies, Britain and France and the United States. And in 1957, West Germany was a founding member of the European Economic Community, the EEC, the European Common Market, which was formed by the Treaty of Rome. And you can see on that map the 6 original members included France, Italy, West Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in purple. And this helped to fuel greater West German stability and prosperity. During the 1970s and 1980s, the common market, the EEC, expanded, as you can see in the different colors on this map, to include Spain, to include Great Britain and Ireland and other countries. In the 1990s, the common market was incorporated, the EEC was incorporated into the new European Union. And it continued to expand until at one point it had 28 members, although as of this month, as of this year, it's down to 27 members because, as I'm sure you all know, because of Brexit, the British have left the European Union, leaving Germany as the strongest and most important economy in the European Union. Next slide. East Germany was not so lucky. East Germany was not so fortunate. For 4 decades, from 1949 till 1989, East Germany was under brutal, repressive communist rule. It was a Soviet satellite. The Soviets stripped East Germany of many of its industrial resources to rebuild the Soviet Union. It was an impoverished, poor, oppressed country. But by November of 1989, I should say, by November of 1989, there were revolutions sweeping across Eastern Europe. The various Soviet satellites in the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe were rebelling against communism. And this mood of rebellion also spread into Eastern Germany. On November 9th of 1989, the government of Eastern Germany, in an effort to ease the turmoil and to stop all the demonstrations that were occurring in Eastern Germany, the government decided, it opted to ease travel restrictions, to lift travel restrictions, to make it easier to travel back and forth from East Germany to West Germany and from East Berlin to West Berlin, which before then had been virtually impossible, or at least very difficult. Once it became clear, once the announcement was made, once people in Berlin knew that they could now freely travel back and forth, Berliners by the thousands began assembling at the Berlin Wall, climbing on top of the Berlin Wall, partying and drinking and singing and celebrating, and eventually, brick by brick, tearing down the 27-mile wall that had stood for decades as a symbol of a divided city in the middle of a divided continent, in the middle of a divided world. A month later, in December of 1989, the great German-American composer, Leonard Bernstein, traveled to Berlin to conduct a Christmas concert, which was based around Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And with 100 million people in 20 different countries watching on live TV, when they got to the choral rendition of the Ode to Joy, he had the choir replace the word Freude, meaning joy, with Freiheit, meaning freedom, transforming the Ode to Joy into an Ode to Freedom in one of the most moving musical performances I have ever witnessed. Next slide. In early 1990, there were elections in Eastern Germany, free elections for the first time in decades, and most of the people in Eastern Germany, most of the voters voted for parties, for candidates who favored unification, uniting the two Germanys into one country. And so later that year, on October 3rd of 1990, Germany was reunited for the first time since World War II. After things were worked out with the British, French, Russians, and Americans, Germany was allowed to reunite with effectively what happened is the government of Western Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, took over the eastern part of the country, and the East German government simply ceased to exist. And in the 31 years, the 3 decades since that time, the two societies have faced a number of challenges. They were very different societies with very different economic strength. The economy of Western Germany was 2.5 times as wealthy as that of Eastern Germany. But they've managed to meet their challenges reasonably well. And now Germany is a united, prosperous, and stable country, and the dominant economic power of the European Union. Next slide. So maybe you have noticed, as you look back over this summary of what we've covered in this talk, maybe you've noticed a lack of famous German women, of great German female leaders and cultural icons. But since the year 2005, for the last 15 years, Germany has been led by a woman, the highly respected Angela Merkel, which has helped not only to bring the country together, but bring it even greater status, greater reputation on the world scene. And so I think we can say that despite its problems, despite its challenges, despite its tortuous and tortured history, by the year 2021, the Germans have come a long way. Final slide. So this is our final slide. This is another painting by the great German romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich called Man and Woman Contemplating the Moon. It was painted in 1824, but I like to see it as a symbol of German unity, as the two Germans together looking out into the future, contemplating a bright future where the hopes and dreams of the centuries of German history can finally become a reality. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Now I can perhaps answer a few of your questions. And I've got some questions over here. Let's see. Here's one from Barry in Sarasota in the United States. Barry asks, how did the Japanese become allies with Germany? That's a very good question, because Hitler talked about the German master race, the Aryan master race made up of people who had blonde hair and blue eyes. And if you've ever been to Japan or know anything about Japan, the people of Japan are not part of the Aryan master race. They are Asians. They do not have blonde hair and blue eyes. But in the 1930s, the Japanese and the Germans were both confronted by the growing power of the Soviet Union, the growing power of the spread of international communism. So in 1936, they formed something called the Anti-Comintern Pact, an agreement to work together against the growth of the Communist Party, against the spread of communism in their countries. And then by 1940, 1941, the Japanese had joined with the Germans and the Italians in what became the Axis powers, the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo Axis, one of the reasons that Hitler wanted to ally with the Germans, or I'm sorry, ally with the Japanese, is that the Japanese had a powerful Pacific Navy. And the German Navy, having been scuttled at the end of World War I, even though Hitler had worked to rebuild the German Navy, it was not nearly as strong as the British or US navies. And so it was Hitler's hope that Germany would, or that Japan would be able, once Japan went to war against the United States, would be able to tie the American Navy down in the Pacific. So that Hitler, while Hitler went about to winning the war in Europe. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but that was Hitler's thinking. Good question. Okay, let's see what other questions you have. Okay, here's one from Al. Where do you see Germany in the future? Thanks for your question, Al. I have to admit that I have a hard enough time predicting the past, let alone predicting the future. Some of the great things that I have missed in my lifetime or what didn't foresee, whereas I weren't able to foresee coming, were the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 9/11 attacks, the election of Donald Trump, the British exit from the European Union. None of these things I was able to foresee. So you'll have to take with a grain of salt what I might have to say about what the future of Germany might be. I should also add that in 1929, before the Great Depression, I, like most other people, would have seen that Germany was moving toward stability and prosperity until the Depression hit and fueled the rise of Hitler. As you probably know, this year, Angela Merkel will step down as the Chancellor of Germany. Germany will be under new leadership, but at least in the short term, I can foresee a fairly prosperous, fairly stable future for the Germans. Their economy has taken a hit this past year because of COVID, as other economies have. But they still have the strongest economy in the European Union. Like other countries, they have difficulties and problems with extreme parties on the far left and far right, concerns about immigration and other concerns. But I think the United Germany at this point looks strong enough to weather the storms. Hopefully that helps answer your question. Okay, here's a good question. Back to one that I just sort of talked about. Didn't Hitler expect Japan to attack Russia in the East? Yes, it was Hitler's hope. The Japanese had been moving by 1939, 1940. The Japanese had been moving into China, moving into Manchuria, in their quest for raw materials. As many of you know, Japan, in terms of scenic beauty and climate, is a very beautiful country. But in terms of mineral wealth, it is very poor. It doesn't have much coal, doesn't have much iron, very little oil. So that Hitler was hoping that the Germans would attack Russia from the east, while Hitler and the German armies, the Nazi armies, attacked the Soviet Union from the west. The Japanese, however, decided something different. They decided that the Japanese had actually fought an undeclared war at a place called Nomonkan against the Soviets, against the Red Army in 1939. The Japanese were sort of afraid of the Russians. They decided an easier target would be to move south and get their oil from what is today Indonesia, which was then the Dutch East Indies, the home of Royal Dutch Shell, the Shell Oil Company, in order to fuel their war machine. So the Japanese in 1941 decided to move south to attack, to gain control of the oil fields in Indonesia, which meant that they would have to move through the Philippines, which was in their way, which was an American property, we would say an American possession, and that led to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941, which left Hitler fighting the Soviets alone. Again, a good question. Let's see if I can move down and find some other questions. Okay, there's a question here about President Reagan, about President Ronald Reagan. Didn't he help to bring down the Berlin Wall? And of course, many of you remember, if you're as old as I am, or maybe not quite so old, remember that in 1987, Ronald Reagan went to West Berlin, much as Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, had in 1963. Ronald Reagan went to West Berlin and gave a stirring speech in which he challenged the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, to tear down the wall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And Reagan's policies have been credited with some, his willingness to work with the Soviets, along with his buildup of American military forces earlier in his presidency to help bring about the end of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. But the end of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe was accomplished primarily through the works of Mikhail Gorbachev, with the cooperation and the diplomacy of the Reagan and the first Bush administration, under the leadership of people like James Baker and George Shultz. So yes, Reagan played a prominent public role in the end of the Cold War, at least in the coming down of the Berlin Wall. Okay, let's see. I want to go back to some earlier questions. Excellent presentation with great documents. Thank you very much, Marianne. Let's see. What do we have here? There was an earlier question that I saw about German immigration to the United States, especially in the late 1800s. Actually, there was a large-scale German immigration to the United States in colonial times. By the American Revolution, about 10% of the population of the American colonies was German. Large numbers of Germans came over. And then again, between like 1870 and 1910, there were about 3 million Germans that emigrated to the United States. Primarily, some of them were looking for land. About half of them became farmers. Others were looking for jobs or for political freedom, for religious freedom. They moved into the major cities. There's sort of a German belt that stretches across from Pennsylvania through the Midwest. Major cities, if you think of cities that produce a lot of beer, like Milwaukee or St. Louis or Cincinnati, these cities became places that were heavily settled, heavily populated by German immigrants, by immigrants from Germany. Today, there are, I think, about 45 million Americans of German descent, which makes German American one of the largest ethnic groups in the United States. Here's a couple of quick questions from, let's see if I can, from William in Houston. Do people notice any lingering resentment by residents of other countries toward Germany for the actions of Germany's leaders during World War II? Well, I can tell you this. Back in 1976 and 1977, after I finished my doctorate, my wife and I and our 2-year-old son spent a year in living in the Soviet Union, living in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And when we were there at the time, this was in the middle of the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, but there was not much resentment toward Americans. They liked Americans. They still saw Americans as their allies in World War II. They hated the Germans. Even the East Germans, even the communist East Germans, they called them the fascisti, the fascists. And there was a deep resentment because, as you probably know, somewhere between 20 and 30 million Soviet citizens lost their lives. Something like 17,000 Soviet cities were destroyed. Soviet economy, the size of the Soviet Union, of the United States east of the Mississippi, was virtually destroyed. So is there still resentment? There is still some lingering resentment. But as the years go on and as the people that have memories of World War II pass on, there is decreasing resentment of the Germans. In Russia today, there is resentment of the Germans and resentment of the West because of the expansion of NATO and the European Union into countries that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc and formerly part of some that were like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, formerly part of the Soviet Union. And here's one I can answer fairly quickly. Do German citizens harbor resentment? But let me see if I can go back down and get it. Do German citizens harbor resentment toward the USA and its citizens for the actions of President Trump during the last 4 years? The answer is yes. Many Germans, many Europeans do. They don't understand what's been going on in the United States. They don't understand the appeal of Donald Trump. He did not, as you know, get along particularly well with Angela Merkel or with Macron in France. And there was a feeling of a lot of people in Europe that Trump was abandoning America's traditional allies and reaching out to people like Putin in Russia. But of course, you can't, just like it's wrong to sort of stereotype all Americans, you can't stereotype all Germans either. There are people in Germany that appreciate and admire, or at least did appreciate and admire, some of the things that President Trump did. So it's not a one size fits all answer, I guess is the phrase that I was looking for. Let me see. I think I have time for one more question. If I can go back. Okay, here's an interesting one. What is a little known fact about the fall of the Berlin Wall that I can share with you? I don't know. I can think of 2 facts. I don't know whether they're little known or not. One of them is that in October of 1989, a month before the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, visited East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, to mark the 40th anniversary of the founding of the German Democratic Republic, which had been created in October of 1949. While he was there, he was met by wild, enthusiastic crowds that chanted, "Gorby, Gorby, Gorby," expecting and hoping that Gorbachev would somehow deliver to them their freedom. The other interesting fact, and some of you may be aware of this, is that on November 9th of 1989, when the East German government decided that the time had come to lift or at least ease restrictions on travel to the West, they found a man by the name of Gunther Schabowski to go out and provide a press conference to read the details of the new travel regulations, the easing of travel restrictions. After he read the details, after he read the statement saying what the new rules for travel visas would be, he was asked by a reporter, well, when does this all take effect? He had no idea. So he said, as far as I know, right away. And the word got out, and that was what led thousands of Germans to head to the Berlin Wall. So it was sort of fortuitous system of circumstances that helped to lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall in that day. So I think that's it. I thank you for your time, for your attention, for your questions. There were several questions that I was unable to get to. I will look at them and see whether I can get the answers to them to you, to those questions to you by email. And once again, this has been fun. I thank you for joining me on this voyage, on this virtual cruise. And as I said at the beginning, I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you on future Viking cruises once we are back on the seas and on the rivers of the world. Thanks again.